John Lennon finds himself in Bermuda. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In 1980, John Lennon decided to take a trip to Bermuda at the advice of Yoko. And so while he was there, John Lennon felt free and it opened up his creative juices. So let us find out what caused this trip and how it became John's trip of a lifetime. So Yoko arranges a trip to Bermuda. Around this time, Yoko had a heroin relapse and got her friend Sam Green to help her go cold turkey. And Green was an art dealer for the Lennons, and Green had an affair with her. That according to the book by Fred Seaman. She sent John and Sean off to Cold Harbor, where they had a house, and she told John it was because she had the Russian flu, but it was to go cold turkey instead. So Frederick Seaman had written in his book that he could see John and Yoko's relationship had reached a dead end. She couldn't stand to have him around, but she couldn't afford to lose him. And John had gotten into sailing and bought a boat, and he named the sailboat Isis, and he sailed it around Cold Harbor. And he had his assistant find out all the literature he could about the art of sailing. John thought about his grandfather and his father and their seafaring ways, but he also had a fear of traveling into the unknown. John spent a lot of time sailing around, and then he decided he wanted to take a voyage. According to Seaman, Yoko thought this was a good time for him to go so she could continue doing what she was doing, and then after she got off heroin, Yoko felt inspired and creative again, and John was soon to get his creative vibe back, first by hearing Paul on the radio with his song Coming Up, and then by going to Bermuda. The trip. John decided he would go on the yacht, and once in Bermuda, Sean and Fred, his assistant, along with Uda-san, the Japanese cook and housekeeper, would fly 7 days later into Bermuda. So John knew that the trip was going to be rough because they had to make their way across the Atlantic, and they had to go through Cape Hatteras with its storms and then into the Bermuda Triangle. John had a crew for the yacht, and since John was the least experienced in sailing, he was the galley cook. So he had to go to Newport Health Food Store to get food. John bought vegetables, brown rice, and got nori that consisted of seaweed sheets, and then John forgot to bring his guitar, so they stopped in a pawn shop to get one. And then John's shipmates brought into the yacht a baggie of marijuana. And when they left at 8 o'clock p.m., the weather was clear, but it didn't last long. The last land they encountered was Block Island, 9 miles off the coast of Rhode Island. Captain Hank was the captain of the ship, and John enjoyed watching him plot the way with a sextant. The captain decided to have a system of watches in case there was changes in the weather. 3 hours on watch, 6 hours of rest. The first watch was by Kevin and Ellen, and John and Tyler would handle the second watch, and the captain was to solo by himself. The passage through the Gulf Stream, a 62-mile wide warm water ocean current, is what concerned the captain, and it turned out he had reason to be worried. After 30 hours of smooth sailing, the Megan Jane began to encounter cloudy skies on Friday, June 6th. The storm clouds moved in and the ocean turbulence increased. All of the crew except for John and Captain Hank got seasick. Captain Hank had been at the wheel for 30 hours and was exhausted. Hank called out to John and said, "You got to drive this little puppy because I got to go to sleep." John had some apprehension at first, saying that he only had skinny little guitar-playing muscles. Hank wasn't worried. John was tethered to a safety harness, and John took the helm at 3 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, and the captain told John he might get wet, but he wouldn't get washed overboard. So John got the experience of a lifetime. He was braving the elements alone. He said, "I was in a major storm for 6 hours, driving the boat, and keeping it on course. And I was buried underwater. I was smashed in the face by waves for 6 solid hours." He said he was having the time of his life. I was screaming sea shanties and shouting at the gods. He said he felt like he was a Viking, And when the captain came up, he found a different John. He was exuberant and ecstatic. The storm raged on for 40 hours, and there were gale-force winds and 20-foot waves, and the storm had driven the boat 70 miles off course, and there was damage to the trysail. And John tried to help with the repairs, and they finally reached Bermuda safely. So John settles in Bermuda. John got a rental cottage, which was lucky because it was in the middle of the tourist season. John picked up Fred, Sean, and the housekeeper at the airport, and Fred had John's Ovation guitar, and John started playing sea shanties as Sean danced around the living room. The next day, he took Sean to Hamilton for the traditional birthday parade in the honor of Queen Elizabeth II. So Bermuda is a full British territory, and they pulled out all the stops, and they had an honor guard along the avenues with a 21-gun salute. And John and Sean were spectators, being in the crowd with thousands of other British people, and it made John feel mildly patriotic. So John got bored rather quickly, though, and wanted to go to a more remote location on the island, and they left to get a rental estate known as Fairylands. And it was there that John got even more creative. He had a trusty shoulder bag from the Dakota, and he had compositions on dozens of cassette tapes. John wanted a TV set up in his bedroom, and he asked his assistant to buy a ghetto blaster and some new music to get his creative juices flowing. He also asked for bongos and a tambourine from the music store. John called Yoko and discussed making a comeback. Yoko thought he should maybe start out doing an EP record instead of a standard album, but I guess John was insisting on a whole album. So John and Fred went to Disco 40, and there was a crowd there, and there was a lot of teenagers and 20-somethings, and John tried to get someone to dance with him, but they all turned him down. And then John and Fred got some beers, and that's where they heard Rock Lobster, and John felt like they were copying Yoko. And it was that time that John came up with Beautiful Boy, and then he came up with the song Borrowed Time, and then he went back to an earlier composition called Dear Yoko. And next he did I Don't Want to Face It. Sean was so happy that John had written a song for him, he was dancing around the living room. And Yoko finally flew in, and John shared with her all he'd been working on. Yoko was consumed with business, though, and she stayed on the phone most of her time there, and she'd gotten there on a Friday but said she needed to leave by Sunday. So John was kind of disappointed that Yoko wasn't excited about his creative spurt, or that she was going to how she was going to set up the studio as he asked her to do. He would call her and play his compositions for her, and he was hoping that she would start creating her own songs. He came up with the song I'm Losing You when he tried for hours to call her and no one answered. While Yoko was at Fairylands, they had argued in the bedroom, and he said Yoko had an incredible memory, and she brought up some past things. When Yoko delivered tapes of the songs John had written to a producer, he loved what he heard, so later Yoko started to get involved in writing her own songs, and she played them for John. So near the end of his stay in Bermuda, John wrote Woman. He said one sunny day in Bermuda, something hit him, and he decided to pay homage to the subjects of his youthful violence, so it went through several takes to get it right. So John's summer adventure had been a success. But before he left, he felt down. John was preparing to leave Bermuda when he heard the news that Peter Sellers had died at the age of 54 of a heart attack in London. John felt that Peter Sellers had been an influence on him, and John sent Fred out to buy all the newspapers he could so he could read the obits and tributes to Peter. They took a final sightseeing tour. There was an Anglican church from the 17th century, and John wanted to stroll around the graveyard at the rear of the church. John told Fred that he and Yoko had settled on the name Double Fantasy as the album name, and he said it would be a concept album. Before they left, John and Fred took a final walk around the grounds of the estate. Fred said it was as if John was thinking out loud when he was talking to him. John told Fred he had experienced weird, reoccurring dreams, and in them he had suffered a violent death. He said to Fred he understood how these visions came to be. He had lived a life of violence, both in thought and deed, and he was destined to die a violent death. He said he fantasized about getting shot, which he said was a modern form of crucifixion, a rather elegant means of moving on to the next life with a clean karmic slate. So Fred was kind of shocked that John was talking that way. He told John that he was only 39, a husband and a father in the prime of his life. He also reminded John that he had just written a lot of good songs. So everyone was packed and ready to go, and John said, "I guess it's time to say goodbye to paradise," and then flicked his cigarette butt into the water. So John Lennon had found a new lease on life when he started to sail around the area near his house in New York. It made him feel creative, and he started to think about writing songs again. John then felt the call of the sea, just as it had for his grandfather and his father, and John found confidence and strength with the steering the yacht through the storms and the rough seas. Bermuda was like paradise, and John got even more creative there, and he got to spend time with Sean in a place where they could swim and ride in a boat. And then Sean also got a song written for him, which made him so happy. So it's too bad that John kept having the bad dreams of his violent death, and it almost seemed like he was doing a form of The Secret by fantasizing about being shot. To feel that way when he had so much to live for is a shame. John always seemed to see two sides of a coin, because I remember his song Revolution, in the lyrics he said, "You can count me out," and then he had to say "in." And also when Paul McCartney said the song, "It's getting better," Paul sang "It's getting better all the time." And John came up with the line, "It can't get no worse." And then John may have had a few negative thoughts, but he was also excited about making a new album and getting back to the studio and seeing if he could still climb the charts. So I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. And I hope everybody's been having a good day. And tune in again soon for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.